the reality is that active defense is not something that most people could do. If this were a skill set that big tech wanted, they'd be out lobbying for it, and they're not. So that should be sending a clear and convincing message.
Welcome to another episode of Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HITRUST, a global leader in cybersecurity assurances. My name is Jeremy Huval, Innovation Officer with HITRUST. I'm joined by Ryan.
Hey, Ryan Patrick, Vice President of Adoption here at HITRUST.
Who are we talking to today, Ryan?
Yeah, we're talking to a really remarkable person in the cyber industry. She comes to us with several years working with Microsoft, and she has kind of shown herself to be an absolute superhero when it comes to combating nation-state attacks and all of the nuances that go into doing something to that effect. And, she's a wealth of knowledge. She is a great cross-section of federal policy and the legal implications of doing some of the active cyber defense that you'll hear during the episode. So really, really excited to have Cristin Flynn Goodwin on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So during our conversation, we touch on active cyber defense, and she's got some cool war stories there from her time at Microsoft. We also talk a little bit about AI and maybe a lot of bit about the latest European cybersecurity regulation called the Cyber Resilience Act and what her views are on that from a legal perspective. So I got a lot out of it, and I'm excited to get into it. Let's do it. Hi, today we're joined by Cristin Flynn Goodwin, a globally recognized leader in cybersecurity and technology law. She has 25 years of experience developing laws, policies, products, and services across every aspect of cybersecurity imaginable. Over 17 years at Microsoft, with 15 of those years being spent as the company's lead attorney for incident response, cybersecurity, threat intelligence, risk management, critical infrastructure protection, law and regulations, source code assurance, government engagement, and sharing programs, just to name a few. To say this guest is experienced is an understatement. She's gone head-to-head with cyber criminals, nation-state actors, and outdated policies. And I can go on and on and on, but we are so lucky to talk to Cristin Flynn Goodwin today. And she's also got her own podcast, Advancing Cyber. And so, Cristin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Makes me feel old, but I'm thrilled to be here. It's great.
Oh, no, the privilege is ours. So today we want to talk about maybe some of the more interesting highlights in your career at Microsoft, as well as just the general cybersecurity technology landscape. Can you tell us about some of the work you've done at Microsoft, advancing the way active cyber defense happens today, and maybe start by just defining the concept?
For sure. And I think it's a really good time to be having this conversation, because active cyber defense and active defense has come back into the political conversation again. You're seeing conversations on the Hill about, should companies have the ability to hack back? Should companies have the ability to engage in active measures to go after companies or bad actors that are stealing your data in this post-ransomware smash and grab data exfiltration sort of world? And so I'd love to get into that topic. But if you think about some of the origins of active defense, what we were doing and talking about at Microsoft over the past decade were looking at, how do you disrupt nation-state actors? How do you look at the infrastructure that they're using at the time in our ecosystem? How do you identify their accounts, any of the tools that they had that were in Microsoft's control? How do you enumerate all of that? And then, unbeknownst to that actor, how do you then turn it all off at once? And so we had a terrific disruption against a North Korean actor that we called Zinc back in December of 2017. It was the first time that a private sector company had decided, all right, we are going to do a disruption against a nation state. And we weren't really sure what were going to be the repercussions. So we had to do a lot of careful thinking and planning about the effects of what happens if you engage in active defense against a nation state actor, coordinated with a bunch of partners. And then we had Boom Day. And that's a pretty exciting thought when you know that a couple hours from that moment, when you unplug all of their infrastructure, there are a bunch of young North Korean cyber actors and soldiers going into their offices, sitting down at their computers going, wait, nothing's working. What just happened? And having them experience a disruption. And that you can read about some of that in the press. There's articles from back then about what that was like. But it set that actor back for a period of months. And that was the first time we had seen something like that in the private sector. And there have been plenty of disruptions since then, but it's really hard to do. It's really hard to enumerate those accounts, and you're only getting a piece of that puzzle, right? Because actors will distribute their infrastructure across Microsoft, AWS, Google, other small, teeny tiny providers that you don't know of because they don't want to be found. So the ability to do a real big active defense and really disrupt these guys gets harder and harder because they know they're being hunted and they don't want to get caught.
So how has the landscape changed since? Did that open the floodgates for other private organizations to do the same?
Well, that's the funny thing about active defense. It's a much more of an emotional topic than it is a technical one, right? Like, it would feel so good if you've been hacked to be like, I'm coming for my data and I'm coming hard, right? Like, if you've had data exfiltrated, wouldn't it feel so good if you're the CISO to be like, and I got it all back? But the reality is that then do you have a technical team with the skills to be able to then go into the servers or the drives on a third party system, which may or may not be AWS or Google or Microsoft's or some third party hosting service that you've never heard of? Do those technical teams have the ability to evade detection? Do those third party teams or do your people have the ability to then make sure that nothing else is touched or harmed or compromised or nobody else's data is accidentally accessed? No. Like, the reality is that active defense is not something that most people could do. If this were a skill set that big tech wanted, they'd be out lobbying for it, and they're not. So that should be sending a clear and convincing message. If it were something that everybody could go out and do, then it would be a tool set that we all have. But the reality is that nobody can be sure that you're hitting the right mark. So it's not a skill set for everybody.
I imagine there's significant tension between wanting to defend yourself and go after the bad guy, like you said, but also staying within legal limits and ethical limits. And I imagine that's where your most significant contributions were to the entire process of helping pave those maybe unpaved paths before. Can you talk about some challenges that you encountered sort of in that front and what that was like?
For sure. We have to make sure, number one, that we are only taking action against things that we own. It's one thing if you see somebody stealing something and they're holding what was stolen in a property that you own. It's something else if you see something stolen and it's being held in your neighbor's house. You can't just go into your neighbor's house and take it back. So having agency and ownership over your own estate, over your own digital assets, means that you have the authority to act. Really thinking through unintended consequences. What if you're wrong? What additional damages could happen? Or if you're right, and then you've still unleashed the Kraken, what happens? Could you be bringing additional harms to your customers that you hadn't thought through, or additional harms to the corporation and adding additional risk there? Those are absolutely things that you have to think about. Or if you then run the risk of having attacks against your customers as payback for actions that you've taken. Those are all things that you have to think about if you're engaging in some sort of an active defense. Is that payback or retribution? I mean, we've all seen mafia movies. Payback and retribution can come in a lot of different forms. So you have to be thinking about the risks of that and the consequences of that, and then helping manage those as you're trying to think about how do you stop these actors from attacking your customers, attacking your company, attacking the ecosystem.
To put the tool of active cyber defense sort of in the right spot for the right company, a lot of companies focus on being resilient against the bad day, reactive, sort of maybe more than proactive. Is that the right place for most companies to be? I imagine only the largest, most well-funded companies can even engage in any type of active cyber defense, or am I thinking about it wrong?
I think that's right. And we're lucky to be at a point in time where, in the case of ransomware and ransomware defense, immutable backups are finally reaching the point where they're being successful. You're seeing 25 or was it 36%? I think CoreWeave had a statistic. 36% of companies were not paying ransoms now, and we're being successful in using immutable backups in being able to restore data. So there's improvements in technology which give you options instead of having to go either pay the ransomware actors off or fight it out. So that's where I think it's exciting, because active defense could include just saying no. And if the actors say, okay, we're going to go forward with our destructive attack in your environment, then restore from backup. That's something that didn't exist 10 years ago.
I have a question, Cristin. So 10, 12 years ago, when I was in the Army on the IT and cyber side, primarily during exercises and training opportunities, we had a policy not to do active cyber defense and definitely not active attack. I feel like that's probably changed to a certain degree. Like, where do you draw the line between active cyber defense and active attack? Because I think right now, active attack is still not something that the United States government will say publicly that they're doing.
Well, I think you're seeing from this government that we're absolutely heading that way. And the United States is moving squarely towards the ability towards more cyber offense. And frankly, that tracks with where other governments are. The UK has been very public about its cyber offense capabilities and growing its military cyber offense capability. And so it would be almost contrarian for the United States to say we're not investing in that space. We have to. China is absolutely investing in offensive cyber capabilities. Obviously, we see Russia's investments in offensive cyber capabilities all over the Ukraine. And that's something that I was at Microsoft. My team published the Ukraine cyber report looking at all of the different attacks that we were detailing that the Mystic threat intelligence team had found. So that's an example of offensive cyber. And you could just see that the offensive cyber attacks at times were ahead of the physical attacks. At times they were coupled with the physical attacks. But that led to the second Microsoft report about Ukraine, calling it a hybrid war, and really highlighting the integration between physical attacks and cyber as a new instrument of war power. So I think for the United States, you're absolutely going to see more and more cyber offensive capability. What does that mean in how it relates to active cyber defense for the United States? I think that's a really interesting conversation. There's some really interesting work going on right now in thinking about a U.S. cyber force. And do we need a combatant command that is focused on cyber? And that would be a really interesting thing to see come to pass, to have a capability that is both offensively focused and defensively focused.
I'm interested in some of the sort of the way these technology laws get created. And I think maybe AI is a current focus of a lot of regulatory thinking and potential regulatory actions is maybe a good sort of case study for this. And outside looking in, I'm thinking back to, I think it was Zuckerberg when he was sitting in front of the Senate, and there were some questions from senators that made it very, very clear that they had no idea how the business model worked of Facebook, let alone how to regulate them with the technology they were working on building. And the famous quote from Mark Zuckerberg is like, "Senator, we sell ads," because the senator literally had no idea how Facebook made money when they gave their product away. And so where I'm going with this question is, Is the technical know-how on the other side strong enough to actually write laws to regulate what needs to be regulated, to think about the risks correctly, and therefore to be able to understand and to think about the right mitigations to recommend? And how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because how you define other side matters a lot. There's a lot of different players in play here. The most effective laws tend to be those that have a healthy balance and understanding of the needs of the policy, the law, and the technology. And they are not overly prescriptive on technology, because the technology is going to evolve and change, usually faster than the law can. And that understands the long-term and evolving needs of the public and the public policy behind it. So when those three elements, technology, law, and policy, are working together in harmony, you tend to have a law that endures. It's really hard to do. What's been really fascinating in the technology space is that the U.S. has been really reticent to legislate much for cybersecurity. That hasn't been the case in privacy. We've had a patchwork of privacy laws all across U.S. states. We haven't had a federal comprehensive privacy regulation or legislation, but we have had state legislation. And Europe has really stepped in to fill the void. And so we have comprehensive regulations coming out of Europe for privacy, for cybersecurity, and now for AI that we simply just don't have here in the United States. And so that's where the devil is in the details. And there's a really great example of this. Instead of using AI, I'll use the EU Cyber Resilience Act. That's one that's really front and center, and it's coming into compliance now. So it's a good one for companies to pay attention to. So let's think about the policy first, right? So the policy goals of the EU CRA were good. They wanted to improve the cybersecurity of products in Europe. Noble thought, and probably the right one too. And so some of the major requirements that sit inside CRA are things like cybersecurity by design, cyber by default. These are things we all know.
Risk analyses.
Right, yeah. Risk management. You have to have an update process. You've got to make sure that your product goes through some conformity assessments to show that you're in compliance. So you've got to do these product testing. And then it has some really interesting and sort of hanky ones that I have some issues with. You've got a 24-hour incident reporting requirement, and there's a vulnerability management and vulnerability reporting process. I'm not a fan of the EU CRA reporting requirement. This one's a little crazy to me. If a single instance of a computer in Europe is compromised, once that exploit happens, just one, then it has to be reported to ENISA and to your national competent authority, but to ENISA within 24 hours of becoming aware, not of determining what happened and doing your proof of concept. It's 24 hours of becoming aware. Now, most of the time, if you have a single machine becoming compromised, you're not sure of what happens. If 1,000 or 100,000 machines or a million machines become compromised right away, you've got a large O-Day. It's a big deal. It's a major attack. If you've got 10, 7, that's a nation state, and they're doing a very sophisticated attack. If there's 4, and that means that all of that data then gets reported into ENISA. And that data then allows for those European member states to start exploiting that data, because they know that there's an active vulnerability that they could use themselves, in addition to being able to go shields up against it. So that's a really aggressive incident reporting requirement, to have any instance of a vuln getting reported. So people don't always understand the consequence of that one. So I'd like to pull on that point.
Very interesting. What are some of the balancing act considerations, some of the tensions that go on the policy side and actually turning that policy into law and regulation. What are some of the balances they're trying to strike between, you mentioned this has to stand the test of time as technology changes. It can't be so prescriptive that it singles out parts of the population at the expense of others. What are some of the others?
I think the hard part for complying with EU regulation is that once the regulation gets passed, then there are always implementation regulations and standards, and those can be quite detailed. And so we're in that window now. So if you are selling products into the European market, now is the time that you've got to be thinking about your vuln management processes. Do you have security updates? Have you started your conformity assessment process to get your product tested and certified? Do you have a cyber design and cyber default process? Because all of those things are going to be required in order to make sure that you are within compliance by December of 2027 when CRA goes into full effect. And so it's this ramp up process that we're in now to get ready by December 2027. And so it's a long, slow progression as you're watching ENISA releasing its implementation and releasing its standards and moving towards that. And so I have a lot of empathy for CISOs, for product teams, and for the compliance orgs, because they're the ones that have to take all of this, ingest it, work with their lawyers, make sure they're understanding what's here. And it's not easy. Like, these are really densely written documents. And every time Europe issues a new regulation, this same process repeats itself.
What impact will it have, in your opinion, on third-party risk and the way third-party vendors, such as vendors, are sort of managed here? Will it have does it change that downstream risk management aspect as well in the third-party space?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you are a third party and you are one that have these products and services, then it's pretty safe to say you're going to be asked to demonstrate your compliance with this space. If you are a part of a supply chain of a company that is reporting and you have a connection into one of these products or services, then you may get swept up into this. And so it's just important to keep cybersecurity requirements on your radar. That's just on the EU side. On the US side, one of the things that gets overlooked is that there's a lot of cybersecurity legislative heat at the state level. And so if you're a company, or if you're in the third-party supply chain side, paying attention to what goes on at the state legislative cycle is also, I think, something for folks to keep on their radar. So it's in the fall now. States kick off their legislative cycles in January, right? That's when the state legislators come back. In 2025, when state legislatures convened last year, there were 1,000 different AI bills that were introduced in all the 50 state legislatures. And while we didn't have 1,000 AI bills passed, it was a much lower number than that eventually. The bigger issue was that it was so high. That's what prompted that conversation in Congress about, can we get a ban on states being able to pass these AI bills? Ultimately, that failed on a procedural amendment, but it's really important to be paying attention to what's going on in the states, because the federal government's not going to be passing any new legislation, certainly not at the level of what happens in Europe, but the states will. And so if you are in the supply chain of a major company that cares deeply about these issues, or if you are a leader and you have third-party companies in your supply chain, then it's important to also look at your key states, because they're the ones that are going to have impact on you.
Cristin, I want to go back to a comment that you made a little bit ago around developing policy, developing legislation and or regulation. Like, you have to be prescriptive but vague, so it lasts the test of time, so to speak. And I have a very particular opinion on this that I want to bounce off of you and get your reaction on. I actually don't think government should be trying to keep up with the pace of technology changes and the pace at which malicious actors are evolving and getting better. They should be pointing to private industry who are much more agile and don't get caught up in years of rulemaking and open comments and so on and so forth. Fine, have a regulation, but it should be pointing to things in private industry that is going to be more timely and more relevant, as opposed to trying to codify it in law. Do you think that's even possible?
I think that that's generally been happening in cyber. I think that if you look at places like telecommunications, where there's actions and reactions, right? If there's an incident in telecommunications, the FCC was exploring, we are the regulator, what's our role here? That's sort of slowing down and hitting pause, because we don't have a regulator for cybersecurity. We don't even have a regulator for the internet writ large. So in the US, it's really hard to have a clear regulation or regulatory body, because the FCC has a little, the FTC has some, CISA has a teeny bit, but not too much regulatory authority at all. The financial regulators have some control over their sectors. So it's so distributed that what you see is reactions or activity in sectors to address particular issues that are sector specific. But we haven't seen anything at that national level that says we need to meet a baseline. And that's both good and bad. I think, and here's the canonical example. I don't know if folks remember, but in 2021, I think it was 2022, I'm bad with dates, China attacked the United States with the nation state actor Hafnium, and they went after Exchange, and Microsoft issued 23 different patches. The attack happened in March. We had the patch out within 24 hours. But because this was impacting a lot of small businesses, we worked with the White House and we had to issue basically downstream versions of patches to meet small and medium businesses wherever they were. Like they had maybe patched once or patched twice or patched 17 times. And so we had 23 different versions of these patches. So where I'm going with this is that we don't have regulations and we don't have systems and we don't have tools that deal well with those teeny tiny businesses that don't have IT teams and don't have tools to manage and sort of lose track along the way. And that's the majority of American businesses. And so that's sort of the weak spot in all of this, is that companies that can focus on implementation of how they're selling into the European market through CRA are generally going to be okay. But if you had an Exchange server and you patched it 4 times and then stopped, that's a really big problem. And so we have to go figure out in the United States how to pay down that technical debt, because those are the third parties in the supply chain we don't know how to deal with. And that's a much bigger problem.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that happen. Our good friend Tom likes to talk about island hopping and leveraging the third-party supply chain to gain access to their ultimate targets. I think that's a huge, huge problem. And I think you're right that we definitely don't have an overarching cyber regulation or regulator. We're very close to HIPAA. We think about HIPAA every single day just based on our background. OCR will come in and do audits or levy fines and things of that nature on organizations that really don't know how to comply with the safeguards because they don't have the knowledge, skills, or expertise. But the other problem is to your point, a lot of those small organizations, are just trying to comply with the regulation that is arguably not going to help them. They're vague, they're not prescriptive, they don't tell an organization exactly how to configure X, Y, or Z to protect themselves, but they have this sense of security because they're quote unquote HIPAA compliant. So to me, that's a big problem in the space, is we have this over-reliance on the government. And not to say the government is bad, but we look to the government for our guidance, and just based on the pace of the government, it moves so slowly that the guidance may be outdated for certain sectors.
For sure. And HIPAA is a great example, because you can have all of the best intentions and you can believe in the important mission of keeping patient information confidential, and you can still have a machine in a small rural office running Windows 2008 that's been out of support for years because it's too expensive to migrate to an upgraded, updated machine. And sort of is the whole point of the conversation, right? Is that technical debt leaves that supply chain weak and vulnerable. And so how do you create that ecosystem that brings those folks to a place where they are not being exposed, where risks are being managed, and it's lifting up that whole community to a place where they are being secured? And if you're thinking about the United States as a third party risk, that risk gets managed. It's really hard to do.
Yeah. I guess the last thing that I'll pick your brain on is when you think about what happened in 2013, 14 around meaningful use through the ACA of adopting a digital platform and turning patient records into digital records, which had a cascading effect on risk exposure. But there was incentives to do that, monetary incentives provided by the government. I've toyed with the idea that we need a meaningful use for cybersecurity, regardless of industry. So those small businesses and medium-sized businesses actually gain the resources they need to actually do something about it. Because to me, that's the biggest issue with small businesses. They just don't have the resources or the expertise to do all the things that they need to do.
It's a really interesting idea, right? It's one where when we think about how do we harden our supply chains, it's a really interesting thing, because the largest companies are outstanding at this. And the largest companies are the ones that are most effective at thinking about withstanding nation state attacks and hardening the ecosystem, and even they get hit. And so there's a real drop off when you get to these smaller companies that have really critical roles in the infrastructure. And so I think that's where we need to figure out a new risk paradigm for those companies, those small businesses that keep getting exploited and then are used to hop into the supply chain, that they hop into the bigger bank, the bigger hospital, the bigger member of the critical infrastructure, because you're accessing that system looking trusted.
And I think there's also an analogy here about organizations often focus on securing maybe their flagship SaaS product for a technology company, but that same organization may have 10 or 20 or 30 ancillary systems that are maybe not as hardened, which are entry points into their environment almost equivalently to the SaaS product. And a bad guy is going to take the path of least resistance, right? And so a lot of what we think about and juggle with is sort of how do you define a compliance boundary or security boundary such that there's a zone of trust that's very hardened, but there's all this other stuff outside the zone of trust that's still under the organization's umbrella that may also have a ton of sensitive data and be that pivot point, that beachhead into a larger campaign, right? And so I think there's a lot of analogies in what we're talking about in that as well.
Oh, preach. I think the biggest legal issues we're going to be running into in the next 3 to 5 years are going to come from agentic AI, because in this space of what's coming, there are all sorts of things, to your point, that get missed. And people are going to be creating AI agents all over the company. And they're going to be creating them within the rules, and they're going to be creating them outside of the rules. And right now, Think about how hard it is to create rules, consistent, repeatable identities just for employees. And then think about how hard it is to create rules around devices and how you're bringing devices into corporate ecosystems. Then think about how hard it is to have machine IDs, because you've got virtual machine IDs, you've got all of the SaaS machine IDs. There's no consistent, repeatable way to identify all of the machines in your ecosystem. Now you're going to be having agents, an agentic AI. You're going to have ephemeral agents that only exist for a few moments. You're going to have agents of agents. You're going to have people creating temporary agents. You're going to have agents that are sub-agents of other agents that exist for the purposes of talking inside and outside of your network. All of that is going to need to have its own rules, standards, and governance. None of this exists yet. There's some really interesting work coming from the Cloud Security Alliance. They've got a framework. Others are going to have to wrestle with this. But this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the future, because CISOs do not have a way to manage identity at scale yet. And so if we're thinking about the next big mass of regulation and challenge for an organization, I think it's going to be, how do you know when you're dealing with a human? How do you know when you're dealing with an AI agent? How do you trust that? What are the attributes that have to be presented when you're going agent to agent or agent to human? And how do you show that in a consistent, repeatable way? And that doesn't exist. And so I think for organizations like High Trust and those in your ecosystem, that's a really exciting challenge. And that, I think, is the future of what we all have to tackle.
Well, we're coming up on time. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your expertise and thoughts on these exciting areas. This is cool for us, and hopefully it is for our listeners as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a great opportunity, and I look forward to checking back in and talking more about agentic AI in the future.
Well, that was a fantastic conversation. I love how Cristin broke down the nuance between active cyber defense and active attack, and how few organizations are really equipped to technically and legally to go on the offense that way, you know?
Yeah, and her point about the emotional pullback of wanting to hack back really stuck with me. You talk to organizations who are impacted by, attacks, nation state or otherwise, and there is this reaction of I want to get even, so to speak. So it really becomes a question of, do you have the resources? Is it ethical? What does the law say? And what are some unintended consequences?
Exactly. And then tying that to the policy side, how law, technology, and public interest have to move together. That's a huge takeaway for anyone working in this space.
Yeah, I agree. And I thought her look ahead to agentic AI was spot on. It's one of the things that you and I talk about pretty consistently here on the podcast, but just generally with the industry. And we're heading into the next phase where identity, auditability, and governance have to catch up fast because the capabilities are coming at us very fast.
Totally. It's clear that the challenges we've been facing in cybersecurity are about to get a whole lot more complex. Also more interesting to maybe guys like us who like to think about these changes as real opportunities to do some good here. But I feel like we could have spent an entire episode talking about agentic AI with Cristin. We may have to have her back on just to focus some more on that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to, hopefully have her back, but kind of see where this all goes. As I joke with people, AI is equally exciting and terrifying all at the same time. So I'll be interested to see what the next evolution is. But big thanks to Cristin for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening.
If you like today's episode, subscribe and share Trust Versus with your network. We'll be back soon with more conversations that push the boundaries of trust, assurance, and innovation. And if you want to hear more of Cristin, she has her own podcast. I mentioned it on the interview, Advancing Cyber. Do check that out as well.